Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Finlay Stanley. Finlay, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you today?
Very good, thanks, Roy. Thanks for having me on board. I'm very excited to be on the show and look forward to telling people about the life of Joe Fagan.
Absolutely. It's going to be a really good episode today. I'm really looking forward to this one, just as we were discussing off air, because it's a chance for me to learn a bit as well, and hopefully all of our listeners will too. You might know Finlay's name from one of the articles that he wrote for us, which we published on our website, which was titled Abide With Me, but it was effectively about the sort of intangible elements surrounding the FA Cup, such as, huddling around the TV, watching it with your family. It was a really great read. If you haven't read it yet, please go and check it out. But through that, we got chatting and we get speaking about some of the things that we enjoy about football. And Finlay mentioned Joe Fagan. Now, obviously, Joe Fagan is a name that I know and that I was aware of, but honestly, I didn't know a huge amount about him, which is why this episode really appealed to me, because it was a chance for me to learn a little bit more about the life of Joe Fagan, his career as a manager, the types of things that he'd done and what he was actually like. And we're going to be digging into why he's kind of overshadowed within Liverpool's history. I know that maybe sounds a bit harsh, but I think it's probably a bit true. But before we start jumping into things properly, Finlay, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, first of all?
Yes, I've been running the channel AFC Finners for almost 4 years now. I started it when we were in our final lockdown. I'd initially intended to start out as a ground hopping channel, which obviously is now. It's a combination of ground hopping and football history. But my intention is mainly to tell stories from football history that people may not know, to help preserve the legacy of footballing legends and pass tales down generations. Also, really enjoy the ground hopping. Do a lot of non-league. The opportunity to promote clubs, encourage people to go and check out games there. But I've always had a fascination with football history ever since I was a kid. I remember when I was a child, I had a VHS called, I think it was just called The History of Football, but it's about an hour and a half presented by former Five Live commentator Alan Green, and I binge watched that all the time as a kid, found it fascinating. I had a nice encyclopedia of football as a Christmas present once that I couldn't stop reading, and I've just always found the history of football really interesting. And one night, just 11 o'clock at night, just thought, hang on, why don't I start a channel, tell these stories. Big fan of Tifo football. I sort of commented things saying, hey, could you do a video on this and that? Like, I was like, hang on, I've got the equipment, I've got the knowledge, why don't I do it? So I did one on Grande Torino, and the rest, if you'll pardon the pun, is history.
And it goes from there. I love that though. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to ourselves in a way. Like, you kind of just realise that other people enjoy this stuff too, but also it's the buzz that you get of telling these stories to other people and talking about something that you're really interested in. So I really like that, man. And of course, we'll put all the links to your social media and your channels in this episode show notes, so our listeners can go and check you out as well. So obviously, Joe Fagan, as we mentioned, is going to be the subject of tonight's episode. Joe Fagan, of course, is the former Liverpool manager. He was probably he is most well known for winning Liverpool's historic treble. I mean, there's no other way to go around it, really. That's what he is most well known for. It's probably his greatest ever achievement as well. But when you mention names like Shankly, Paisley, Dalglish, and all the other Liverpool greats, Fagan is almost a bit of an afterthought, and I've got a few questions on that later on in the episode. So I guess we should probably start at the very beginning. First of all, to just talk a little bit about Joe Fagan, his early life, the type of upbringing that he had, and his playing career.
Yeah, I completely agree. So he was a Scouser through and through, born in Liverpool, and did have a trial for the club when he was young, but amazingly he turned it down. I think he's concerned about his playing time, but he ended up joining Manchester City, but he had a string of bad luck with injuries, and then the outbreak of the Second World War saw him, when he was old enough to partake in the military, he was deployed to Egypt as a radio operator, but he also spent a lot of time playing in wartime games. But eventually, after the Second World War, he did finally get to play at a senior level for Manchester City, and grew a lot of admiration from the Sky Blue supporters for his work rate. But football never left him. After he did have to retire quite young due to injury, he spent time with lower league sides coaching, and he started off combining his coaching career working whilst also inspecting boilers in factories. But he ended up at Liverpool, and he filled almost every coaching position available at that club, finishing off in the perfect way as manager. And I think he was just such an incredible servant to the club. And I think like the names that do get the credit for Liverpool are absolutely fantastic. Like they absolutely deserve the credit they get.
Of course.
But like it's not to say, for example, like Rafael Benitez doesn't deserve credit.
Sure.
Like what he did was incredible, but he won 2 trophies at Liverpool, like absolutely achievement. Joe Fagan in 2 seasons, in his first one, he won 3 trophies, a treble that had not been done before. I think it's completely fair that someone like Benitez gets credit, but I think not just for the 2 seasons as a manager, but for the years of loyalty Joe Fagan gave Liverpool in all kinds of different roles, and for the role he played behind the scenes in their great success under Shankly and Paisley. I think you got a statue of Bill Shankly, you've got a stand named after Kenny Dalglish, and you've got a statue of Bob Paisley carrying Emlyn Hughes at Anfield. I think Joe Fagan does deserve a statue of his own. And I think there was recently a plaque unveiled to him and the boot room. So the likes of Ruben Bennett and Ronnie Moran, and do forgive me, I can't remember all the names off the top of my head, but at least there is something paying tribute to the boot room. But I think absolutely for the loyalty he showed for the club over many decades, I think without question he deserves his own statue outside Anfield.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what I'm quite interested in as well, as you just touched on there, is more his role behind the scenes of everything. Sometimes it's turned into a little bit of a cliche with some managers in modern football where, you've got this kind of maybe a little bit more charismatic guy who is the manager, but then you've got someone behind the scenes who's actually more tactically aware than the manager is. Again, it's a little bit of a cliche, but I've always been kind of interested in these people who operate in the background and seem to be the people who are actually laying the foundations for success. So we'll get on to that in a moment. Tell us a little bit about what his management career was like, because you mentioned there as well that his playing career had to end very early, and he did do a bit of a stint in non-league. And I think actually, am I right in saying his coaching career began in non-league as well? Was it Nelson? He was a player manager or something along those lines?
Yeah, he worked on the coaching staff at Nelson. He was, funnily enough, recommended. He was at Rochdale and he was under management of Harry Catterick, and he recommended Fagan as the coach to the Liverpool manager at the time, Phil Taylor. But Harry Catterick, funnily enough, went on to become one of Everton's greatest managers, and led them to become they're obviously rivals anyway, but to strongly compete with Liverpool for honours in the 1960s. But yeah, Fagan joined Liverpool when they were an unremarkable team. They were just like a team from a big city in second division with a little bit of success, the way you might look at teams such as Sheffield United or Sheffield Wednesday right now. But basically, Liverpool lost to Worcester in the FA Cup, and Phil Taylor would end up resigning later on, with that being a big part of it. But Bill Shankly was appointed, and it was assumed that he would bring his own staff, but he decided to keep the people there, such as Joe Fagan and Bob Paisley, and he built his boardroom around that. When he met Joe Fagan, he funnily enough said, "You must have been a good player because I tried to sign you." Shankly had tried to bring Joe Fagan to Grimsby when he was the manager there. But yeah, he was friends with a man who coached a non-league side called Guinness Exports, who were made up of workers for Guinness. And as a thanks for helping coach the team, he would often get gifts of crates of Guinness and other ales. And
doesn't sound too bad.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I'd rather take that than the salary.
Absolutely.
but with all the gifts he was given, the only convenient place to store them was in the Roman Anfield where they kept the boots. So there'd just be all these crates of Guinness all over the place. And then after a game, they would sort of sit down, share a few cans of stout, discuss the tactics, life and all that. And this all became a place where all the coaches could sit together, plan the team out. and it played a key part in the success. Like Bob Paisley said, it was like going to a local. You have a full and frank exchange of views every Sunday, and that boot room helped serve the club with many, many honours over a period of about 30 years until it was eventually knocked down. But Fagan set up that room as a place to meet, and a succession of coaches that started with Shankly and ended with Graham Souness saw the greatest period of success English football has ever seen.
That's incredible. There's really something in that boot room metaphor, I suppose, in the idea of it, that it's just like a kind of origin point for success. And I think these are the types of things where heritage obviously comes across really strongly, because the types of things are like place, memorial, remembrance. You know, I've gone on about this in other episodes, but it's such a shame that that boot room's not there anymore, because it'd be a fantastic asset to still have. But you can get a sense that when those conversations were taking place, you'd imagine that Joe Fagan probably had quite a big input in those as well. Obviously, we know he was highly respected by the managers that he served under and the different coaches that he worked with. So I think it would be fair to say that Liverpool's success should be attributed to him as well, because of the work that he done, the help that he gave others, and the assistance that he actually gave to the different management teams in setting up tactics and, you know, different squads and things like that. So, I mean, we'll come on to his managerial career in terms of Liverpool, but as we've kind of touched on, Joe Fagan, he does deserve to be mentioned alongside the likes of Shankly, Paisley, Dalglish, etc. But as we've been discussing, his achievements with Liverpool are overlooked a little bit. And I think forgotten's probably a bit extreme and maybe even a bit overused as well. But I'd say that the fact that he won a treble, the first time it had ever been done by an English club, it doesn't really get the recognition that it should, and I've always wondered why that is. And I have a couple of thoughts on it, but again, we'll touch on those later. But I wanted to know, first of all, why you think it is that Joe Fagan and his achievements don't really get that recognition.
Yeah, it is a shame, because, like, I think, like we're saying, like, what the achievements hold up to compared to everyone else. But I suppose, because what the issues you have is, like, when the conversation about English managers comes up, everyone will know that Howard Wilkinson was the last English manager to win a top flight title at Leeds in '92. But a lot of the time, especially when the discussion following Tuchel's appointment and the discourse of English coaches came up, people would say there hasn't been an English manager winning the European Cup since the 1980s, but nobody actually says the name of who it was. And you know, it was Joe Fagan, and you had Tony Barton doing it a couple of years before Aston Villa as well. But I think the fact he was such a unassuming character, that, like, he wasn't someone that seeked the limelight. He was just, like, when you do see the interviews of him, he was a very unassuming gentleman. He's very polite, very charming, and you just kind of can't help but fall in love with him. Whereas other managers of the time, such as Clough, Shankly, and Revie, have more of a, like, sort of controversial presence. Like Clough and Shankly weren't afraid to ruffle feathers, and I suppose because of that conflict, their interviews perhaps stick in people's minds for different reasons. But, like, if you look at interviews with Fagan, they're very charming, they're very sweet, and I think, like, they definitely deserve a lot of credit. But I suppose because he didn't seek, like, I suppose they say seek and you shall find, and he never was seeking for the limelight. I suppose it's also a case of the length of time, because obviously Bob Paisley was also a very unassuming figure, but the amount of time he spent in charge of Liverpool and the amount of trophies he did win just means that he sort of naturally, the forces of admiration just came into place. But for the record, I don't actually think Bob Paisley gets the credit he deserves either, for similar reasons, for being the unassuming figure. But he does at least get a lot of credit. Whereas Fagan, I think Paisley gets near the amount of credit he deserves. I don't think Joe Fagan gets anywhere near. But yeah, I think it's a combination of perhaps being a figure that didn't seek the limelight, the brief time he spent at the top level, but also, sadly, his time was strongly overshadowed with how it ended with the Heysel Stadium disaster, which obviously, yeah, I mean, it's you can't really put into words how horrible that all was. But as a result, his departure and he went very quiet afterwards. He sort of retreated and never really came back out until he passed away many years later.
I think there is something in that as well that you've mentioned, the fact that he was quite unassuming. Maybe by nature was just a man who preferred to operate under the radar, and that's okay. It's strange how these intangible things can alter people's perception and memory of certain managers, particularly the years go on. I mean, Joe Fagan was in charge of Liverpool over 40 years ago now. So, eventually that's going to begin fading out of living memory. And, these kind of narratives that we write about people when we talk about history will end up becoming second-hand experiences instead of first-hand, and that's how people's memories and how they're remembered get altered. So, that's quite a big thing in it as well. And I think maybe the fact that he was someone who preferred to work in the background probably does play into that a little bit, but you kind of touched on it there as well with Bob Paisley. I agree with you that I don't really think he gets the recognition that he deserves either, but one thing that he had that Joe Fagan didn't was longevity. So in your opinion, Finlay, what would determine how a manager is perceived historically? Because you've got these different things like longevity, success, or impact. I mean, obviously, with how football is in the modern day, it's very, very fast-paced. Managers can come and go within the space of months, let alone years, and everything seems to be measured on win rates. How many trophies have they got in X amount of seasons? But in the era that we're talking about, particularly with Paisley and Shankly, these guys were at Liverpool for comparatively to now a very, very long time. So how much do you think that actually plays a part in affecting the perception of Joe Fagan, that compared with some of his colleagues, he wasn't there for very long?
I think it's definitely a key factor because, like you said, the amount of time Bob Paisley was at the club and the amount of time that Shankly was at the club as well, also combined with how you compare the club with where they were when Shankly took over in the late 1950s to where they were at the end. And a lot of people could say, I think Shankly is by far the best of the three managers because where the club were when he took over. Paisley and Fagan continued to win with a great team, which is still a great achievement because you look at what's happened at Manchester United post-Ferguson or Leeds post-Revie, for example. It's very difficult to do that too. But I think because they didn't transform the club in the way Bill Shankly did, perhaps that's part of the reason they do get overlooked. But one of the key things of Shankly was he wanted to make sure that the people behind the scenes got the credit. He was the one who he didn't mind the limelight, he didn't mind the interviews, but Fagan played such key parts in it as well as what he did his 2 years in charge because he under Shankly he was reserve team manager, so helped young players such as Ray Clements, Ian Callaghan and Tommy Smith come through the ranks and become legends at the club. And under Paisley, they had probably the best manager and assistant manager duo of all time when you look at what they won. But there was a famous instance where Liverpool in the early 80s were really struggling in the league. And Joe Fagan, normally very quiet, decided, right, I'm not having this. And essentially gave the entire squad the hairdryer treatment. And it was halfway through the season and basically said, you're all playing as individuals, start playing as a team, and they ended up winning the league that season. So he could do it when it counted. And there's another famous story of when Tommy Smith, now an established member of the first team, refused to sweep the dressing room because he felt that was the youth players now, and he threw his toys out the pram until Joe Fagan said to him, Tommy, pick up the brush, son. But then years later, when he won his first league title with Liverpool, they came into the dressing room and Joe Fagan was sweeping it up. So I guess he never lost that common touch. He always remained humble.
Yeah, it's weird because it's the kind of person that reminds me of like Danny McGrain or Tommy Burns at Celtic that are just part of the fabric at the club, and I suppose maybe that kind of plays into it as well. In that if a person has literally worked in every conceivable area of the club or part of the club, doing different jobs, doing odd jobs, they're just that sort of ingrained within the culture of Liverpool in this case, that their managerial career almost kind of becomes just part of what they've done as opposed to being this big thing or the main thing that they've done, if that makes sense. I don't know if I've worded that right, but yeah, I mean, it's just interesting thinking about the different things that can actually impact how we remember someone now, and how people write about them in terms of history. But, as you mentioned there, his managerial career wasn't without its flaws and its ups and downs, obviously, but the same can be said of Shankly and Paisley too. But because they had longevity on their side, they're remembered a little bit better, obviously. And the way that Shankly set his team out, I think, as well, is remembered too because of how impactful it was and sort of forging how tactics are in modern football as well. Just in terms of Joe Fagan's managerial career, do you want to tell us a little bit about his time actually managing Liverpool? Because as you mentioned there, obviously he won the treble with Liverpool European Cup, but then the season after, which was quite rare for Liverpool at the time, they actually went trophyless.
Yeah, so it was a very similar position to the one that Bob Paisley was presented with when Shankly retired. Like, Bob Paisley retired and he'd won all these trophies. When he came in, people were thinking, how's he going to emulate Shankly? And then he did, won 3 European Cups, 6 league titles and more. And then it was a similar situation, he was their best ever manager. And Joe Fagan didn't want the role, but he saw it as his duty to the club. And they also didn't want an outsider to come in and tear everything up. But I suppose it's like the line in Dune. I won't be able to quote it exactly right, but it's a great leader doesn't seek to lead, they are called to it. Something along those lines. But he saw it as his duty to the club, and he was beloved by the players. He was always seen as someone who, when you were down, he would be able to put an arm around the shoulder. But it's very interesting when you read, like, we've obviously spoken about how overall, sadly, he doesn't have necessarily the legacy he deserves, isn't spoken about. But when you do hear people who did work with him speak about him, the amount of respect they give him is incredible. There's several interviews with Graham Souness I rewatched in the build-up to this. And, Graham Souness is obviously renowned as rather an abrasive pundit, can be very... in the most professional way ever. Is seen by many people as somebody who looks at confrontation, but when he talks about Fagan, he's like a completely different person. With that, you just understand the humanity that Fagan had. Like, there was a time when Liverpool won their way to an away game to Southampton, I believe it was, and they stopped at a service station, and Graham Souness had to make a call to his brother because he knew his mother was severely ill, and he got the phone call, found out his mother didn't have long left. And Joe Fagan sat with Souness with his arm around his shoulder for the rest of the journey, just to make sure he was okay. But yeah, he was just a very kind and caring human being. You just see that in the interviews. Like, there's one with John Motson after they've won the league where he's just like very gentle and jokey with him. There's one after they beat Athletic Bilbao in the European Cup where he's just drinking a beer, chatting and having a good laugh. And he just charms. But in terms of him as a manager, I think he just had a very relaxed demeanour. There's an interview with Brian Clough on management where he basically says that, like, if you're going to do anything to the best of your ability, you've got to be relaxed. And I think Joe Fagan definitely did that, because I think when you read the story and the build-up to the 1984 European Cup final, it's incredible how he managed it. So he took his players to Israel, even though they were playing at the Stadio Olimpico in Rome, in the build-up to the final, so that he could get his players to take their mind off the game. And he gave Graham Souness loads of money to basically get his players to go out drinking and take their minds off it. But when they came to the final, so they played Roma in the Stadio Olimpico with only 15,000 Merseyside faithful in there. But the players were so relaxed in the tunnel that they all just started singing a Chris Rea song together. And when the game got to penalties after finishing 1-1, Joe Fagan was still unfazed, and he just said, "Look, I'm so proud of you all. Just know whatever happens, I'm so pleased with what you've done. I like what we've been able to do together." So he just played it cool. I think he was just so happy to have the privilege to do such a thing. I think he just had a really relaxed approach that meant people could trust him and would run through walls for him. Because obviously a lot of time in management, you need the good cop and the bad cop. And like you were saying at the start, he knew how to be that nice man who would pick people up when they were down and get them to start again. And with the amount of young players he helped bring through the door, he certainly knew how to make people feel the best way they possibly could about themselves. And with the success that they had with him working for the club, it's clear to see he was an effective personality.
For sure. I think it's like going back to what you mentioned about having quite a relaxed demeanour. I think with the likes of Joe Fagan and other players as well who were in his position, when you've been involved with a football club for so long and you've done every possible job you can for them, there's probably an element of being able to get away with having that kind of demeanour, but you're always going to have that respect with the players, whoever they are, whoever they've come through from, even if they're new, because they know that you're part of the club as well. So again, it's quite interesting looking into all these things, but by all accounts, he sounds like an absolutely terrific man. Someone who actually cared about the players who came through, not just under his managerial stewardship, but also just as he was a coach, when he was doing other odd jobs around the club as well. So, and that's, you know, that typifies the type of person that he was. And again, it's just a shame that he's not remembered in the way that he should be, in my opinion anyway, because these kind of things are almost unheard of a little bit these days, and he's sort of pointing to this idea that he was one of a dying breed at the time, but no one really knew it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think his departure was sort of the beginning of the end of the boot room era at Anfield. Obviously, there was the line of succession did continue with Kenny Dalglish's excellent time in charge, then followed by Graham Souness. But by the time Roy Evans, who was like a latecomer to the boot room, took charge, you could see the club and ethos they had built really start to leave, and they, you know, the sort of Spice Boys side, as they were known, of the 1990s were a completely different team to the Liverpool that everyone knew. But I think it's like just I just think the whole idea, again, going back to the statue, is like, if you go somewhere like, let's just say Sunderland, and you got the statue of Bob Stokoe, there can be a 5-year-old who would say to their dad, who's that? And he says, oh, he's Bob Stokoe. Bob Stokoe did, and then you got a story, passed it on. And, you know, they say people die twice. One, when you physically die, and the second time is when people stop talking about you. But it makes me so happy that Bill Shankly and Bob Paisley have those statues. And when I went to Anfield with my friends, like, it was just nice being able to, like, they obviously knew of Shankly and Paisley, but being able to tell them the stories I knew about them. Like, when you see a statue and you tell someone about that person, it almost feels like you're doing your duty to them to pass on that story. So I just hope that can one day happen for Fagan. But yeah, it's like everyone who speaks about him just speaks with utter adoration. I've posted the video I made on him on fan forums, and there was a Liverpool fan who said he once saw Joe Fagan as like an old man in a local Sainsbury's, and he had a trolley full of Carlsbergs, and but this person sort of made the point that it was like the amount of beers Joe Fagan must have supplied the club, and that was the beer that was sponsoring Liverpool. Isn't it sad that he had to buy his own Carlsberg after everything he did? It's only a little thing, but I do think someone like that's a very good point that person made.
Yeah, that is a very good point, actually. It's when someone's done that much for your club, the least you can do is at least make sure that his fridge is full or something like that. You know, it's quite sad in a way as well. But, you know, you kind of touched on it earlier as well. Heysel and the stadium disaster, it had an impact on everyone who was involved, but it did have a massive impact on Joe Fagan as well, and actually went quite a long way into his decision to retire from management. That very much seemed the case.
Yeah, it was never intended to be a long tenure in charge of Liverpool. He just wanted to do like a couple of years and then retire, and I think the plan was to go at the end of that season. But like, him and the players didn't understand the full extent until they left the stadium. Like he said, like, there's a very harrowing interview of him after the game where he's sort of saying they'd heard rumours that maybe 5 or 6 people had passed away, but at the time they were rumours, they just didn't know. And he was in agreement that playing the game would have stopped further disruption, but he just seemed so disillusioned with that interview you watch. It's truly heartbreaking. He was just saying, like, it didn't feel like the game he grew up with, even though there was absolutely nothing he did wrong. He felt like he'd let people down, and like the memory of the last game, I would say ruins, that sounds disrespectful, but I'm sure people will understand like what it means. Like you go in and like it's a European Cup final, perfect way to end a career, and it's suddenly out of nowhere turned into a horrible tragedy. And he said he just wanted to brood in the corner after a game. And there's also very sad footage of him when he gets back to England and he's with Roy Evans and he's just crying into his shoulder. And it's heartbreaking to see such a gentle man be brought to tears like that. But they said, like, afterwards, people described him just as a broken man. And yeah, he never really did recover. Like, it's just like when you look back at the interviews of him before then, he's so smiley, so jolly, almost has like a sort of like, I guess, a Bob Ross kind of presence, just a very wholesome character. But then it was like then a switch just flicked and he just essentially disappeared from the game and passed away around 16 years later. Like, he never seeked the limelight anyway, but he basically just went quietly after all that. And obviously the full extent of the tragedy is so horrific, and it's just, it truly was one of the darkest days in football. And it's like, it's horrible. The like people just wanting to go to a game, see the biggest game in club football and not coming home. And it's horrible that Fagan, given his life to football, ended his footballing life having to see something that nobody should ever see and something that should never have happened.
Yeah, it hit him particularly hard. It traumatised him, as it would anyone else who was there. I mean, as you said, it was an absolutely horrific event, one of the darkest days in football in history, and you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who was there who didn't become traumatised or wasn't affected by it in some way. But like you said there, it's just a shame seeing someone who's so kind-hearted, someone who's so well-meaning, and someone who absolutely adores football, having their love of football. And again, that it maybe does sound a little bit disrespectful, and I understand that, but having their football in life ended by something so tragic that they had to witness, and feeling that he shouldered some of that burden. And it is a shame because, as you said, he really did retreat from public life after that. He was very rarely in the spotlight, very rarely, if ever, in interviews or speaking to media, and just, yeah, it's a huge shame. And again, it's something that within Joe Fagan's story, almost, it seemed like a bit of a footnote, which I thought was a bit odd, because it seems like this thing really, really impacted him and was the reason that his footballing career ended, to be honest. But it, again, and maybe it's just I hate using this term, but a product of the time where, people didn't talk about how they felt, didn't talk about their feelings, didn't try and seek help for it. And perhaps there is an element of that as well. But it seemed as if this horrific thing that happened, that he witnessed and that traumatized him, doesn't really get attributed to how he then became as a person.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair reflection. It's but again, it's like it is almost like flicking a switch in what you do see afterwards, just the facial expressions before and after. Like you look at most of the photos of him and he's smiling and just radiates pure joy, and then after that night it completely gone. But it's strange how quickly things can turn, like, because that's how it ended. But the year before, like, what he did, again, no one had ever done that. Bill Shankly won 6 major trophies when he was in charge of Liverpool. His first season in charge, Joe Fagan won half of that. Like, he just seemed unfazed. Like, he guided them to a 4th League Cup in a row, 3rd league title in a row, first team to do that since Herbert Chapman's Arsenal, and a 4th European Cup. It's like you tell people that, that's someone's first season in management, like,
it's incredible.
But then I think there's just an element of beauty to his casual nature towards it, because of the whole approach to the final. But then there's the iconic photo of him just chilling with the European Cup by the swimming pool in the hotel. It's just such a beautiful photo, and it's for all this posts, like football pictures that go hard. I don't think any beat that one. Like, because he just
a good one.
just so effortlessly graceful. But again, it's like, I think when you tell anyone about him, it's one of those things where sometimes you have a hyperfixation on a particular person. You just end up like falling in love with them, and I think it's very much the case like that, because I've seen like comments people who lived in Liverpool, because obviously this is where people are a lot more accessible. It wouldn't be a case of living in mansions in Cheshire. They'd be living in the terraced housing like around the corner from Anfield. And so many people have said that like Fagan was so charming, such a pleasant person to be around. And I've seen so many people who said they were toffees, but they absolutely loved him. And I think it's, a symbol of a different time where you could have that respect. But, now the way like all the mass media and stuff, like you've no doubt he'd get a lot more credit, be interviewed a lot more and stuff. It's just a shame that with the time, sadly, some people get forgotten. But sometimes it just is for some reason, it's some individuals get overlooked. And yeah, maybe there's a combination of like it being more people looking at the players and what happened and stuff. But I hope in what we do today, like the conversation we're having, what other people have said, will help preserve the legacy of Fagan, because none of it would have been possible without him, and he played such a large part in the success, not just of Paisley, but of Shankly as well, with the work he did behind the scenes. And, no, there's never one individual that can change everything. Shankly worked wonders, and the club would be nowhere without him, but they will also be nowhere without Fagan, Paisley, and many others.
I completely agree, and that's a brilliant sentiment. It leads us nicely on to our next part, as the legacy of Joe Fagan and how we remember him, because within remembrance, of course, when you're talking historically, it's almost like a narrative. You're going through each individual thread chronologically to understand this person and everything they went through. And the good that, there's good and bad in that. And that's a different topic in itself, is kind of historical remembrance and historical memory of different figures throughout history. But obviously, you've said there is this happy, smiling man. Football is his life. He's nonchalant when it's anything that comes to the game. He's very relaxed. He's very chilled. He's just someone who radiates happiness and joy. So when we come to be remembering Joe Fagan, that's obviously the type of person that you want to be remembering as well. How do we go around remembering these figures who are often overshadowed? Because it's like, with Shankly, he has that quote about football. Again, it'll be a paraphrase, not word for word. People say football's a matter of life and death. That one.
Yeah, I love that. That's all my go-to quotes. One of my
favorites. Yeah, it's a phenomenal quote, and it's weird because obviously that's an iconic quote, and Shankly is absolutely iconic. We're not saying he's not, but it's almost like Joe Fagan wasn't as sexy as that. Do you know what I mean? Like
I know what I mean. It's again, it's like we're saying with like Shankly and Clough. They were the sort of media darlings is the right term, but they were pure Hollywood box office. They were just, you could ask them like their favorite type of biscuit and it would be entertaining. Like they just I suppose it was I'd say arrogance, because they could back it up. I suppose they just had egos in a positive way. Like, obviously look at, like, it wasn't like they had sort of Nicholas Bentner style egos. Like, they had the right to talk the way they did because of what they achieved. Whereas, like, with Fagan, I guess, again, if he'd had that kind of forceful personality, he might be more remembered. But then again, he probably wouldn't have been happy to have been a reserve team manager or an assistant. But I think there's definitely like strong pockets of Liverpool that do appreciate him, because when we did the stadium tour of Anfield, the 1984 European Cup was such a big highlight of it. Like that, I think, got more coverage than any of their successes. It was like key moments, like were here, there, and everywhere. They'd say, first FA Cup, first league title, and all that. But the 1984 European Cup final against Roma was like almost a novel in itself. Just the amount of detail and the amount of stories that came from that. It's just, even though, like, when you think about it, winning a fourth European Cup, it's a remarkable achievement, but it's like, it's almost an oddly specific one to choose, like your fourth European Cup. But I suppose when you read into it, how Fagan went about it, it just is an incredible story. But we saw this Liverpool-themed pub by the docks. I was with my friends, and there was a picture of Fagan with the European Cup in, like, holding it up in the air. And, like, my friend didn't know who he was, so I told him who Joe Fagan was. But again, it's like you had something there paying tribute to him, a big picture, and I'm sure there's lots of people like who have grown up knowing Rafa Benitez and Jurgen Klopp who would say, "Who's that?" and then their dad tells them a story, and so forth. The legacy is cemented.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think the go-to is always a plaque or a statue. Do you know what I mean? Something like
Yeah,
physical and tangible. But I think, and it maybe actually suits the character of Joe Fagan and similar people as well, that their stories are more told as if it would be folklore. And there's an element of storytelling to it as well. Whereas these media guys, they would have loved having their statues because, as you said, they're Hollywood. They like the limelight. They like getting the recognition because there was a bit of an ego there. Whereas guys like Fagan, again, maybe it's all speculation, but potentially they're the kind of guys that would prefer their story to just be passed down through word of mouth, to hear it from other people, and to hear it from the mouths of the people who actually went to see them and who knew them personally. And, you know, there is something quite special and quite unique in that as well, and a bit different to all the statues. But, you know, remembrance in football is important, especially when it comes to role models. And in terms of, you know, we've spoken about on the show before about, you know, Joe Fagan, when you look at the area of Liverpool that he was from, if there was like a plaque or a bench commemorating him, something that people in the modern day could go to and say, well, oh, he came from where I came from, that's the type of thing that can inspire people, and it's really good in terms of putting roots down in places as well. So, I mean, obviously, I'm guessing that if there was ever a chance to be involved in some kind of plaque or statue for Joe Fagan, you would bite someone's hand off to take it.
yeah. I mean, obviously, there's people far more involved with not just Liverpool, but like Joe Fagan's family than me, who I think have like obviously I'm sure they'd be in agreement with me, but like I'm sure they'd have more of a right to say what they feel tribute should be. But no, absolutely, I completely agree with you. I think it'd just be nice to something else to preserve the legacy, and obviously, like I said, there is the boot room plaque. Which is a fantastic thing. I do forgive. I forget the artist that made it, but it is a wonderful piece of work, and I think it's such a fantastic way to pay tribute to the people that made Liverpool the club they are, and like the footballing juggernaut that the world recognises them as. But yeah, no, I think, you know, for the years of service he did, like the things he achieved, like the role he played, he was Liverpool through and through. He gave his life to the club, and it's sort of the holy trinity of Shankly, Paisley, and Fagan. But he's perhaps the one that doesn't get. I think he's very much the Holy Spirit that isn't always spoken about in terms of in as much as the others. But no, absolutely. I hope that more tributes are paid to him, more stories are told. But there's obviously like been a sort of boom in people wanting to learn more about football, not just the results on the weekend and stuff. And you know, I think there's definitely a way of saying, "Oh, this guy, in his first season at Liverpool, he won a treble," and
That's
like
epic, isn't it?
yeah, exactly, it is, and
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
it is
what
though.
like he was like his was one of the first videos I made, and I immediately like this must be about 4 years ago now, but I immediately said to my friends, and I'm not normally one to toot my own horn, but sometimes you do make a piece of work and you look at it and think, this is a masterpiece. And I think I was very proud of my work until then anyway, but I think sometimes you just look at something and think, yeah, I've really done well here. So that was like, I think, a special moment for the channel as well. And I'm really proud and hope that if anyone who knew Joe Fagan personally sees that, I hope that they feel I've given him a fitting tribute. But it was a very emotional one to make because of the respect I have for him, but also the tragic way in which his career came to an end. But I just hope that more people know his name and his legacy will continue to live on in the stories that are passed down through the generations.
Yeah, and that's I think a great way to wrap up this episode. Just in terms of remembrance and remembering these figures who don't get the attention that they maybe deserve, who are often overshadowed by maybe their sexier counterparts, whoever that might be. There are different ways to remember them that isn't just in the form of like a plaque or a statue or something that's tangible. There's different ways that you can bring attention to them and their stories. And I guess, and this is the thing, I think the best way that you can honour someone, the best way that you can preserve their memory is just by telling their stories and making sure that it doesn't die. And this kind of brings it full circle. It comes back to what you said earlier on, that the first time you die is when your body's laid to rest, but the second time you die is when no one remembers you. And I think there's something in that as well, is that if you don't tell these stories, you don't tell people the types of things that they've done, and it goes out of living memory, then people can go and look at a statue and they'll say, who is that? Do you know what I mean? It's the stories that make it what it is. And I think in terms of preservation, in terms of heritage, I think the preservation of the content, I suppose, the story, as opposed to the remembrance of the tangible, is maybe, something that I guess it's not to make one more important than the other, but you would rather the story was preserved than loads of efforts put into a statue if no one's going to know who it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the key thing is obviously like a statue could help generate those stories.
Definitely, yeah.
But yeah, hopefully, I think it's like they obviously have done the statue of Bob Paisley carrying Emlyn Hughes off the pitch, which I think is so symbolic because it's a statue of someone who filled every role at Liverpool carrying their captain off the pitch. I think it's very symbolic of what he did for the club. So like they certainly knew how to pay respect to him. And I think considering the sort of sad stories about how they treated Shankly poorly, and there's elements about how they treated Fagan not so well after he left. I think hopefully it's, obviously the people at Liverpool now aren't responsible for that, but hopefully like it's a way to make amends to the families. But yeah, I imagine something could happen, and I'm sure that like if nothing comes up like a statue or something, as long as we just keep passing on these stories down and understand, like Liverpool likely to win the league this season, but I think it's important that we remember the people that built the club as they are now and where they got to, because lots of people don't like Liverpool. I didn't like them growing up, but I think they have such strong respect across the footballing world. They're one of the greatest and most successful sporting sides in the world, and I think it's not easy doing something like that. And there are certain people who helped to become that club that a lot of people might not speak about every day that they absolutely should.
Yeah, it's weird because you talk about football clubs and then you talk about football institutions, and Liverpool are very much the latter, and I don't think that can be disputed. But you're absolutely right that it's about how we remember them. It's about remembering these people who have laid foundations for how our club's now, and it's about remembering that our, grandparents, parents, uncles, whoever, if they're fans of the clubs that we support, would have went to see them as well, and that's how it all ties together. And at the end of the day, that's what heritage is and what part of it is. Listen, Finlay, this has been a fantastic chat. It's been a really good episode. Just before we finish up, do you want to plug your channel one last time?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube under AFC Finners. I'm also on Instagram and now BlueSky. I'm not on Twitter anymore, thankfully. But yeah, if you can subscribe, it'd be much appreciated. I do weekly uploads, like a good mix of football history and ground hopping. But yeah, I check out grounds up and down the country and tell stories of some of football's greatest moments. And if you'd like to learn more about Joe Fagan, you can see my video on him. But there's also hundreds of videos on other fascinating characters from the history of football. If you like stuff like that, my channel's a place for you.
Definitely. And as I said, we'll include the link to the channel and the link to the Joe Fagan video as well in our show notes, as well as your social media, so that our listeners can go and follow your content on there. Of course, if there's anything that you want to speak with us about, any questions about this episode, or if you want to contribute an article or suggest a topic for the podcast, then you're more than welcome to get in touch with us. You can DM us on X, BlueSky, or Instagram, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. We're always up for a chat. If there's something that you want to discuss that you maybe aren't sure about, then just let us know and we'll see if there's something that we can fit in with the project. But for now, Finlay, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. See you soon.
And it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.